All right, it's that time again. Time to make the next video. So this is something that I've always wanted to give a little lesson on. It was one of the favorite things that I struggled with in back in college, I believe it was. Something called the ontological argument. The ontological argument for the existence of God. And there is this dude named Saint Anselm who came up with this famous argument. And it's basically an a priori argument, which means it doesn't require any evidence to be logically sound. All right. And so when we go through this argument, you can decide whether it is actually logically sound. All right. Now, St. Anselm tries to prove that God actually exists. What I'm going to point out here is that his argument actually proves that God does not exist. But I think you'll find as we go through the argument together, that it's kind of a reassuring type of non-existence. All right. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because this kind of a framework that I'm going to be showing you here is kind of the backdrop for all of the ritual work in the Kabbalah magic course, and for all of the ritual work that you might conduct in theurgy or in Tantra or any non-dual type tradition. And it's kind of fundamental to any kind of spiritual practice, in my opinion, to have this sort of ontological argument looming in the background, informing everything you're doing in the foreground. All right, so let's look at the argument itself. Now, I have to warn you, Saint Anselm existed at a time, it was right after the Dark Ages. This is before Chaucer, and if you've ever tried to read Chaucer, it's pretty nightmarish. English has it has evolved significantly since then, for better or for worse. It has, and so if you try to read Chaucer, it's like, is this English? This looks like half German, half English. All right, so I don't know what dialect Chaucer was writing in. I'm not really an expert on that. Actually, Saint Anselm existed before the time of Chaucer, in the 1000s, and his writing is actually easier to read than Chaucer. So I'm not sure why that is. Maybe somebody can explain that if you are a really deep English major. Here is the ontological argument itself. So you might want to like freeze the screen here and read it for yourself. I'm going to take it a step at a time and then demonstrate why it is so important to Hermetic work or the work of theurgy or the work of Tantra or any spiritual path for that matter, especially a non-dual type path. This is the first part of the argument. All right, so he begins, remember, he's trying to prove that God exists. All right. Even the fool, when he hears of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Now, this use of than is really confusing. I don't think than works that way anymore in English, so we can translate that to of. Even a fool, when he hears of a being of which nothing greater can be conceived, understands what he hears, and what he understands in his understanding, and what he understands is in his understanding. This is not a very difficult concept, really, okay? Anything that you can understand is sort of encapsulated in your understanding. So in other words, your understanding of things around you is limited because you are a limited human being. So when you form a concept of something that you see or experience, it is now held within your understanding. Okay, so this is a bit confusing here because a being of which nothing greater can be conceived is within your understanding, okay? That's not really possible because if you are trying to conceive of something that, of which nothing greater can be conceived, it's going to be much bigger than your understanding can contain. All right? But there's a reason why it can be said to exist within your understanding, even though it transcends your understanding. It goes beyond your understanding. Okay? If by transcending your understanding, I mean this thing, this God concept, this God thing is much bigger than you. So how could you possibly hold it within your understanding? You cannot encapsulate God because God is much bigger than you. Okay? That's actually quite a simple concept. The language here makes it difficult. And assuredly, that of which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. Here, St. Anselm now is saying that, well, yeah, if it arises within your understanding, if it's God, it's going to have to be bigger. So yes, God can arise within your understanding, but he's much bigger than your understanding. So you can only see a little piece of him at a time. You can't see the whole thing. If he's bigger than you, how can you possibly contain him within your limited understanding? Okay, but conceivably, there are parts of him that you might be able to see. They sort of pass through your understanding, and as they pass through, it's like, oh, that must be part of God, something like that. Okay? Therefore, if that of which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being of which nothing greater can be conceived is one of which a greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. This is basically acknowledging that the same thing we've been talking about. If it arises within your understanding, it can't really be God as it is right there. Okay, because God is much greater than can be contained within your understanding. Okay, so if you've got this God concept that you've kind of wrapped your head around, okay, that concept itself cannot be God. Because God, by definition, is greater than anything you could possibly understand. All right. However, that doesn't mean you can't see God. Okay, because if something's much bigger than you can possibly understand, you could see part of it, possibly. Okay, so it's not really possible for you to apprehend God in your limited understanding. See, this is not really so complicated because everybody kind of has heard that. Our human mind can't possibly comprehend the majesty and the greatness that is God. Hence, there is no doubt that there exists a being of which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. So, if there is something much greater than you can possibly conceive, it would exist both within and beyond your understanding. Okay, so if it's really so big, you can only see part of it, and it exists beyond, outside of your understanding. Okay, now there's a problem with this, okay, because he's actually proving that God does not exist. Okay, so in order for something to exist, it has to stand out versus something else. This is pure phenomenology, okay? So if something can be conceived to exist, you have to be able to apprehend it. It has to stand out versus something else. And if God, by definition, cannot be compared to anything else because he's too big, then he doesn't exist. And if we might want to clarify this a little better, okay? So St. Anselm kind of proves that God does not exist. Now, this gels very well with the way that Kabbalah presents the mystery of the Godhead. It also gels very well with the void of Buddhism. Okay, these are concepts that are much older than St. Anselm. In Western philosophy, Saint Anselm is someone who's given credit for coming up with the ontological argument. This is not original to Saint Anselm. It arose in Buddhism and in Vedanta well before anything even in Western civilization even arose, actually. Okay, and this is something that even I would imagine shamans understood long before civilization began. Possibly, well, okay, shamans. To wrap your head around this, well, you can't really wrap your head around it by definition, but to understand it, it's helpful to adopt the view that the universe is a drama. Okay, so what we have here is a stage with nothing on it. So in this sort of conceptual framework here, nothing can be said to exist yet, because there's nothing on the stage. Okay, so this is the ultimate background of non-existence behind everything that exists. Anything that exists is something that can now stand out in the foreground, but the background behind existence is non-existence. Okay? And the language gets really tortured here because I just said the background is non-existence, but that doesn't make any sense. You mean non-existence is? That's kind of the way St. Anselm was trying to paint it. Well, non-existence is in the background, therefore it is. But no. The only things that can be said to exist are in the foreground. And the things that exist in the foreground are the things that you can conceptualize. In other words, you can circumscribe them with your mind, you can wrap your head around them. You can see the contours all around their edges, and now they become objects for you. And if they sink back into the background, then they cease to exist. They cease to be objects, or they cease to be concepts in your mind. So this is why in my videos I've been presenting these various bubble diagrams. And as you might recall, I'm not sure what video this was from. I think it was from the Four Worlds of Kabbalah. I presented this as a 4-level diagram, and all you can see are 3 levels. There's the waking consciousness, and then there's your dreaming sleep, and then there's your dreamless sleep. And what else? Oh, there's the background behind that. There's the white space behind that, which is in Vedanta is called Turiya, which simply means the 4th level, or some people call it deathlessness. All right, so this background that has no bubble limiting it, there's no bubble around the white space, okay? It just has no boundaries. It seems to go on forever. It's limitless. That's the level that's furthest in the background. That is the background of non-existence. And in Kabbalah, we have the veils of negative existence, which is kind of the same concept. So these, in order for the universe to come into existence, there has to be a space opened up within that white field of nothingness. And then these various things begin to sort of bubble forth within it, and they can be said then to exist. But anything outside of that big cavernous space is non-existence. And the way Kabbalah presents it is negative existence, okay? But, it simply means if you can't wrap your mind around it, it can't be said to exist. There's no, if your mind cannot make an object out of it, it does not exist. And this is your levels of consciousness as they step forward from that background of non-existence. All right. And the interesting thing is that when you begin to make progress in spiritual work, your mind gets better and better at sinking into the background. But eventually this is going to cause, for most of us, it's going to cause a panic attack, because what we begin to notice is that oh my God, I'm dying, I'm disappearing, I'm becoming non-existent. I'm going to be overwhelmed and destroyed by whatever's in the background. Yeah. Another way of looking at it, the ego's in the foreground and it exists, it's bodied forth by the higher self, and the higher self is bodied forth by the non-existent background. Okay, so this is pretty much proof that God does not exist because God is not an object. He cannot be circumscribed by the mind. And the only things that can be said to exist can be wrapped up in bubbles. Okay, only objects can be said to exist, or concepts, which are concepts in the mind, are like abstract objects that also stand forth from the non-existent background. Okay, or the negatively existent background. So if you read Dion Fortune's Mystical Kabbalah, this is explained quite in depth. I'm hoping maybe I explained it a little better here. And what you'll notice is that this fear of being wiped out, when you die, you begin to notice that, well, everything kind of comes forth from this background, which is constantly bodying forth things. So is there really anything to fear? Yes and no, because of course we have natural biological instincts in the field of the universe that have evolved to fear disappearing back into non-existence. But of course that non-existence is God, and that's basically what Saint Anselm was saying. For some reason, he basically was assuming that the thing in the background, or that no-thingness in the background, exists, and that makes his ontological argument ultimately confusing. Okay, but if you look at things in terms of phenomenology, things that become phenomena can only be seen to exist if you can conceptualize them or wrap your head around them or put a bubble around them to understand them. Okay, if you can't put a bubble around it to understand it, then it doesn't really exist. Okay, it's too far in the background to exist. Okay, so and what you'll notice, like in your middle pillar work, this is kind of, if you draw a line between divinity down to the higher self and down to the ego, draw a line straight down there, that's kind of what the middle pillar is. Okay, and that middle pillar, does it exist? Does it not exist? Well, it kind of doesn't. Okay, it's just an aid to get you to tune into these kinds of diagrams. And what you might begin to notice is that when you look at a standard tree of life diagram, like the one I have behind me, back here, right? I'm hoping that this sheds some light on diagrams like that. It's a helpful way of looking at them. All right, and so that sphere at the top of that diagram is pretty much up there in divinity, like, whoop, it's up there in divinity right there. Okay, and then the higher self is pretty much at Tifareth, Doth, Tifareth, and ego is down in Yosod and Malkuth. Okay, I'm hoping that helps. None of these diagrams are correct. There are only tools to get you to understand how things stand forth from the background of negative existence. All right, that's a relatively short video this week for once. All right, until next time.